All right, thank you everybody for coming. I'm Dave Schwed. I'm the director of the Cybersecurity program here at the Katz School of Science and Health at Yeshiva University. With me, I have Ivan Brightly. Ivan is the Chief Information Security Officer at Galaxy Digital. He's been a miner, investor, advisor, and founder in the cryptographic digital asset space since 2012. Prior to joining the firm, Ivan co-founded SolidX Partners in 2014, which offered synthetic institutional access to Bitcoin through a total return swap and pursued an SEC registered physically backed Bitcoin ETF. It's a lot of acronyms. Yes. Prior to SolidX, he was at the foreign currency trading firm FXCM, where he served as the Chief Information Officer. As CIO for FXCM, he was responsible for the global technology needs of the firm. He's also a certified Bitcoin professional as deemed by C4 and is a certified information systems security professional. And he holds his BA in economics from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Okay. And Michael Shaulov is the CEO and co-founder of Fireblocks, a secure digital asset infrastructure company. He's a serial cybersecurity entrepreneur and investor. Prior to Fireblocks, he was the head of products, mobile, and cloud security for Check Point. Prior to his role at Check Point, Michael was the CEO and co-founder of Lacoon Mobile Security, which was acquired by Check Point. He's an investor in Armis IoT Security, Orca Security, and Hexadite, which is acquired by Microsoft. He's also a recognized industry speaker, delivered talks at RSA, Black Hat, and InfoSec. There's more. Before his commercial endeavors, Michael pioneered the mobile security field in an elite military technological unit, the 8200, where he received the Israeli Presidential Excellency Honor for his contributions. He holds a BSc in computer science and physics from I should know that, University in Israel. Okay. All right. Adam Healy is the head of information security at Bakkt, which acquired a digital asset custody company. Bakkt is a majority owned by ICE, the International Continental Exchange, which also owns NICE over a dozen other exchanges. At Bakkt, he oversees the physical, cyber, and technical security programs. Adam has over 15 years of cybersecurity and systems engineering experience spanning several regulated industries. This experience includes numerous roles within the U.S. intelligence community and the Department of Defense. Adam's government service was part of Microsoft National Security Group, where he led cybersecurity engineering teams at Palantir Technologies.
We had to make some edits to my bio.
Yeah, that was very long. Oh, hold on. Last but not least, this is Yuri, and I had to actually bribe him to get his last name, which is Stav, and he's the Chief Security and Development Officer for Genesis and Digital Currency Group. Okay. Thank you, everybody. All right, so my first question to you guys is, how different is it really to protect blockchain-based digital assets? Do traditional institutions need to really put that much extra effort into securing them?
Welcome, everyone. Thanks, David, for having all of us. I won't judge you for messing up my bio, but we'll talk about that later.
It's a little less embarrassing than not being able to pronounce a university in Israel. So that's okay.
Especially with all the research that they've done around jumping the air gap and other things. It's kind of sad to hear that. But yeah, so is it that much different? I think there are a lot of orthogonals and other types of industries that have been around a long time that have had to protect similar things, right? There's certificate authority industry, things like Thought and VeriSign, government agencies, compartmented programs, banks, financial services. I think really what is beneficial is being in crypto now, being in blockchain tech now, is being able to learn from all of them. My approach has always been to try and not reinvent the wheel. So one of the things that I've done that we did at DACC, and we brought that over to Bakkt, is being able to look across all these different industries that have similar types of risks, similar types of threats, and really model a set of controls and a security program that takes a superset of all of the best practices. Some things from NIST, some things from SOC certifications, some things from DoD or NIST and others, and building a superset of standards that is most applicable to the types of assets that we're controlling, the types of assets that we're protecting. Because at the end of the day, all we're protecting, at least when it comes to most crypto assets, is a really long random string of numbers that you have to keep in a really safe place. but also have it readily available so you can execute transactions. So is it that much different? I don't think in aggregate, no, but I do think you have to really take a much more holistic approach when you're thinking about the types of things that you're protecting, how often they need to be accessed, and as we've seen in recent breaches, very serious nation-state actors that are coming after these assets.
So I think that clearly there are things that are similar, but I think that the real main thing that is not that you don't see in the traditional financial system is that in this system you basically don't have a recourse, right? You cannot, if there is a breach, and that's actually something that I've seen at the very beginning when I started to deal with digital assets or crypto, is the same group that basically like the North Korean group, when they initially started to go after those assets, before that they hacked Schwed. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story, but they basically hacked multiple banks. They were able to get to the SWIFT processor. They were able to basically transfer something like $280 million from the SWIFT system. But eventually SWIFT was able to recourse $200 million, right? So they were only left with 80. When we became part of the investigation team, when I was still in a checkpoint, they were basically able to steal $200 million worth of Bitcoin, and there was no recourse, right? Like you couldn't call Swift or you could call anyone, tell them, hey, that was actually like a fraudulent transaction, maybe you can recourse it. So I think it's one of those really unique situations, specifically in the financial system, but also I think even when you look at the certificate authority, where what is lost, cannot be recovered or cannot be remediated, right? There is a finite number of, specifically if we're talking about Bitcoin, there is a finite number of Bitcoins in the world, and if they are being stolen, they cannot be recreated. So I think that this situation clearly requires us to utilize our knowledge from the traditional financial system or from traditional controls, but I think it does require a fair amount of new innovation of how we approach this problem, and not everything that worked for us before is sufficient to actually address this.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the comments that were just made, and to the point that it isn't terribly new, the idea that you have information you need to protect, and that the mechanisms used to protect it are pretty much the same as used today. They've been used for decades now. The idea of having separate networks, air-gapped machines, physical security, separated teams, isolation of systems, limited controls, all the rest of that kind of stuff has been in place now for many companies for decades. The difference is that you're now combining finance plus very tangible assets. Almost like bearer bonds of the 1960s, which even those were different in the sense that those bonds could be canceled. You ultimately could go ahead and go back to the issuer and you could just reissue them. You could go ahead and cancel them. You could inform people that the serial numbers on those bonds were no longer going to be used. Cryptocurrencies, at least public blockchain cryptocurrencies, there is no way to ultimately cancel assets. You may end up being able to go ahead and tag them, trace them, be able to go ahead and inform most of the better actors not to go ahead and do business with them, but ultimately the funds are withdrawn from the company that loses access to their keys. And so it's really just a much more specific threat than sort of these vague threats of breaches where maybe you end up exposing a bunch of corporate secrets or data which has sort of undefinable value. Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies, they have very defined values.
So speaking of methods to achieve secured cold transactions versus hot transactions, can you touch on different thoughts on the benefits and maybe the additional risks of having to have a hot transaction?
Sure, I'll start with this, and some of the others can get into more specifics about various mechanisms that they use to employ security techniques. The biggest question you usually start off with is how readily accessible do you need to move assets? If you're not going to hold something that needs to be transacted with on a daily or hourly or by the minute basis, then that gives you a lot more flexibility than if, say, for example, you have an algorithmic trading system that needs to go ahead and place 100,000 trades a day, which need to be matched with basically a settlement of those funds at the time. If you can go ahead and settle T plus 1, T plus 2, T plus 3, now all of a sudden you have the ability to go ahead and keep keys held in a much more secure facility, and it gives you time. Time is an amazing thing from a security standpoint. It gives the opportunity to have multiple eyes on a particular transaction to give their approval to go ahead and deny a transaction. It gives basically the ability to go ahead and veto transactions before they ultimately get sent. Anytime that there's something which has to be done right away and you only have 60 seconds to do a compliance check, you're going to be able to do less work than if you end up having a full day worth of settlement checks where you have multiple eyes being able to go ahead and deny the transaction. From a cold storage standpoint, there are a number of ways that these transactions are built. The ultimate name of the game is to go ahead and create a set of keys that are derived on a machine which is secure of malware, which is not connected to any particular network, and then perform all transactions on that machine where it never interacts directly with a network or any other type of insecure device in order to go ahead and remove the keys. There are a wide variety of techniques that we'll get into in terms of how you secure those keys, but it's something that it needs to be very thoughtful from the very start about how you design these systems. There's something basically called a key signing ceremony or a key generation ceremony, and there are companies like VeriSign that will literally spend north of a year with full teams planning out the process for the physical location, the people who will be present, the audit checks, and it's this orchestrated dance of maybe 100 people that need to be involved to go ahead and ensure that the machines that were used to generate keys were sourced properly, that the mechanisms they used to bring in entropy to go ahead and generate truly random keys were sufficient. Sometimes, believe it or not, we're still back to the physical world where the most secure way of actually bringing in entropy for a key generation is to actually use dice or to use some other mechanism for introducing randomness. And the amount of effort that goes into, let's say, for example, a bank or a VeriSign type of company to go ahead and create those keys is enormous. I'll turn it over to some of these guys to talk about some of the specifics about how they handle either cold storage or hot wallet, type of transactions.
So I'll just jump in for a second. So one, it is actually, Ivan brings up an interesting point, and Yuri and I have spent probably a number of hours over the last year talking about this in detail. So much of all this fancy encryption, fancy math, cutting edge blockchain tech, in some cases it literally gets back to a bunch of letters in a stainless steel panel. I mean, we're basically back to like letters carved in stone as a last ditch recovery mechanism in many cases. But I did just want to pause for a second and just backtrack. We all spend all of our days 24/7 thinking about crypto and blockchain, but just to add a little definition around hot versus cold and some of the terms that we throw around. So for those in the audience that may not be read into kind of what that means, the 10-second version is hot or warm generally means it's connected to a network, usually eventually to the internet, hopefully if you're doing it right through some degree of brokered interface, controlled interface. Cold means not connected to the internet, and there's varying degrees of cold. People throw that around, cold and frozen. Just, it's not connected to the internet or not connected to a network. And then there's a whole myriad of best practices that you get into around how do you store keys that are cold on systems that, to Ivan's point, are properly sourced, and you have supply chain controls on, and multiple people are involved in all these different steps, and they're inside copper shielded Faraday enclosures, so rogue radio frequency waves can't. There's all these other things, but I just wanted to say that before I think Michael was going to say something. But really, hot, warm, connected to a network, eventually to the internet. There's clearly risk there. Cold, in a vault somewhere offline, makes it much more difficult to steal, short of an angle grinder and some type of assault on the building.
So I guess the area that we focus on is basically how to secure the hot flows or hot wallets. Here, this is I call this also a challenge, from a different angle. Hot, the problem is that because because your system is always connected to the internet and there is a path for the attacker to essentially access the components that you have that are exposed, the attacker sort of has an infinite amount of opportunities to try and probe your system and try to find a way to get in and compromise. So at least in a high level, the approach that is usually being taken in those systems, actually going back to what Adam said earlier, to bring the best know-how in terms of how do you protect things, is sort of the philosophy that we have around, I say cloud security, which is micro-segmentation, right? It's almost like you have a submarine. How do you make sure that if a torpedo hits near the submarine doesn't get flooded instantaneously? And the way that it's basically being done is, as you probably have seen in the movies, the submarine has compartments, right? So if one of the compartments, basically if a torpedo hits next to the submarine, one of the compartments breaks, but that's the only part that is being flooded, so the submarine is exploded at once. So the best practice right now, at least in terms of protecting hot storage, is sort of to achieve some level of both defense in depth, right? That you have multiple layers of security, but also individually each one of those there is a compartmentalization of the components, the keys, and also the general ecosystem of where the funds can go. Because this is basically what defines the security, and essentially what you're trying to achieve is that even if the hackers were able to breach one point in the system, it will actually take them a very long period of time, or it will not be trivial for them to actually propagate to the other parts, and with only one part, they cannot basically transmit or create transactions.
So let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So in your perspective, what are some of the main attack vectors and tactics that are actually used to compromise? Like, what are you actually protecting against? What type of attacks are you seeing, or are you looking to protect yourself against?
The most obvious one is social engineering. It's the one that works the best. If you have an organization where, say, for example, an email from the CEO or the CFO will go ahead and execute in a transaction. Say, for example, if the CEO says that, look, I want you to send 1,000 Bitcoin to a counterparty we've done business with, here's the address, and if that will be acted upon, that will end up being something that loses people money at some point, because it's not that hard to go ahead and get an attacker to either forge an email that looks like the CEO, or eventually be able to go ahead and break into an email system or some other communication system, especially if they're wily about it, and they'll do it at a time when the CEO is on a plane and can't actually go ahead and countermand the order. And if the organization will just carry that out, then that will go ahead and definitely result in losses. And so that's the most obvious attack, and it's the one that's actually worked the best. Probably not limited to cryptocurrencies, limited just in general for most financial attacks. We see it at the family office level, where you have a lot of family offices which will get a forged email or an email attack instructing somebody to go ahead and send a wire for some transaction that sounds plausible, and a certain percentage of those get executed, and so it ends up being bank fraud and wire fraud that ends up being just as easily to go pull off. Works very well in cryptocurrencies. A lot of other attacks, but it's the number one thing I think to watch out for.
So you could clearly say all of the normal cyber, other types of issues, the more advanced things, like I've mentioned, things around like radio frequency or acoustic. These are like super edge cases, very sophisticated attackers. But the thing that that probably keeps me up at night the most is insider threat. And I think there's also this, and it goes really hand in hand with social engineering. You have to have enough people that can do something without the right approvals in place. But insider threat, at the end of the day, you are, which I'm really trying to get out of the habit of saying at the end of the day, because my girlfriend likes to say at the end of which day. But at the end of the day, you really are trusting some group of people within your organization. Let's say you're an institution, you're trusting potentially a completely separate third-party custodian to hold your assets for you. You're not just trusting that entity, but you're trusting some of those employees to not abscond with your funds to Venezuela. And there are humans involved in this that have to, especially if you're dealing with cold wallets, that must put on shoes and walk to a vault and put in a bunch of biometrics and key cards and other things and do some operation to sign a transaction and broadcast that to the blockchain. And I'd be curious to what others on the panel think, but there seems to be some degree of, is it 3 people within an organization? What's that fault boundary? Is it 4 people? How do you scale that? Like there's all these different issues that you have to think about. But I think the type of threat that keeps me up most is the insider threat piece. We all like to trust our people. We all like to think that we hire good people and we train them well and we treat them right. But if there's $100 million in Bitcoin sitting there, how much do you trust them? So I think that gets into kind of to Michael's point around defense in depth and having controls that fail, and there still being n number of other controls that will stop nefarious things from happening.
Just to add one more thing to that too, agreed on the insider threat. Part of that ends up being potentially mitigated from accountability. If there is a set of keys, which 4 people potentially could have access to those keys, and you don't know which of those might potentially be the culprit, it is much more likely that somebody will think that they can get away with it. Whereas if there is a set of keys which are derived only for one individual and with which basically nobody else potentially could possess, that puts a layer of culpability and responsibility on individuals, and it at least is a mitigation for for employee collusion. You're less likely to think you can get away with things if you know that you'll be the culprit.
It's probably somewhere where Michael, you should talk about MPC. We should talk about MPC a little bit, as probably the only method that I know today that can prevent collusion. I don't know, guys, if you can hear me.
But I think before we jump, I think that a lot was discussed around the private key, right? That basically the ultimate control over the funds, which the private key gives you, and clearly, if someone, through phishing or through one of the other or insider threats, that's sort of that's the end of the game. But before you actually reach that level of compromise, what we've seen is that there is a fair amount of basically, let's call them phishing attacks or man-in-the-middle attacks or a variety of attacks that will compromise an individual transaction. Right? So at the end of the day, when we trade, usually you usually need to receive an address from your counterparty to basically transfer the transaction. And in the case, and basically because there is a communication involved between 2 parties, the attacker can basically compromise the communication path in a variety of points. And at the end of the day, you think that you got a deposit address, or basically the account number of the right person, but effectively you're signing a transaction, maybe with the specific value that you wanted to transmit, but you're basically sending it to the attacker. And there were many compromises through the years that were involving those attacks. I think we've seen a very famous one is basically I think was My Ether Wallet, that they basically compromised the DNS servers and basically they shifted the whole traffic through their servers. There was a recent attack where an exchange called Gate.io, the hackers were able to compromise actually a third-party provider to them, basically plant a JavaScript that was loading in their website and was presenting a deposit address that belonged to the attacker. So when people were basically funding their account on the exchange, they were funding the attackers and not their account on the exchange. So there's a fair amount of actually those attacks. Also, we've seen cases where probably the longest standing issue with internet security, basically credential theft, that hackers basically harvest a large number of credentials from exchanges, sometimes even trading bots. And even if everything is set up correctly, eventually they will go to the exchange on behalf of that client, and they will basically do a market manipulation. They will basically take the Bitcoin that is pre-funded on the exchange, and they will sell it against some very illiquid assets and basically withdraw the funds that way. So, so those are some of the issues. Also, clearly there is a smart contract a problem that was like, when it's like a very famous thing. It's like, when Ethereum in the setup of Ethereum, basically when Ethereum ICO, they had the DAO, and the DAO was compromised with a smart contract that was part of that, of the financial activity.
I would add one more thing too, because we talk a lot about protecting these private keys, which allow you to affect control of these assets, and but there's also, when you start to get into institutions and larger funds, there's all these ancillary systems. So if you're dependent in order to execute a transaction on, say, something like a blockchain node, and somebody can enumerate what that node is and DDoS it, and now prevent you from actually broadcasting a transaction, they have damaged a mission-critical, a business-critical function that is prohibiting you from operating. So there's all these other things. I would just underscore, it's not just the private keys. That's the cool thing. But there are all of these other just good hygiene things. I like to say, like, when I talk about cyber hygiene, you can take all the antibiotics you want in the world, but if you don't wash your hands, you're still going to get sick. And I think that, so you have to still apply all of those good hygiene things to the ancillary systems that you're using to run your crypto enterprise, whatever it may be, whether you're a custodian or a trading desk, or doesn't matter. So just something else to consider.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's not, the goal isn't always necessarily to steal the assets. It could be to disrupt the business, which in turn will, hurt them reputationally, and they'll lose revenue. So every major technology and every major vendor has vulnerabilities. We see that with Cisco, we see that with Citrix. What is your thought on the protocols themselves? Do you think that there are yet to be discovered vulnerabilities in the code or in the blockchains itself? Anyone want to comment on that, or you want to?
If you look at the space, there's maybe 2,000 plus implementations of public blockchains today. There's other implementations of private blockchains. There is not equal security between the top 10 and the bottom 10 for sure, no question. We've seen that the simpler a blockchain is constructed, the simpler a set of transactions that can be made. If you look at something like Bitcoin and Ethereum, Bitcoin has a very limited set of scripts and a limited set of operations. It's not what they call Turing complete. It can't run a purely arbitrary application as part of the process, whereas Ethereum is capable of running arbitrary applications very slowly, but is still capable of doing this. And as a result, with Bitcoin's greater focus on security, on simplicity, on eliminating pieces that are not necessary to go ahead and make that work, we have seen that Bitcoin is fundamentally probably a little bit more secure than Ethereum and some of the other ilk. From a pure value standpoint, Bitcoin is the world's largest honeypot. It is at this point $100 billion asset class, where you are subjecting it to attacks literally by the second throughout its 10-year history. Is it possible that there are unknown vulnerabilities in it? For sure, it's a possibility. There have been vulnerabilities that have been introduced. Usually where the result could be something like the network would potentially disagree with an upgraded version of nodes and software that was produced, and say, for example, some attacker would be able to create a transaction which would split the network between the nodes that agree and the nodes that don't agree. This could result in losses, but so far to date, there have not been any type of flaws in something like Bitcoin or even Ethereum where a transaction could be forged. If you possess your keys, if you manage to go ahead and maintain them offline and keep them in a secure manner, there is no way to go ahead and forge or create a transaction on your behalf. Other situations can occur, but it is at least secure enough that the fundamental cryptography that power these systems makes it very, very challenging to go ahead and actually go ahead and break and disrupt the system at a totality level. So the answer is that it depends upon how many security researchers are paying attention, and how much effort is being made to go ahead and actually secure the blockchains, and then how simple they are. The more complex they get, the harder it is to secure them.
I think I agree, because it's definitely very impressive from a security standpoint. how resilient both Bitcoin, the major blockchains are. I don't think we've seen any database technology, Oracle or any other that had the security properties of those, like at least the top blockchain implementations.
One of the things I see with wallet providers is they're touting multi-sig. Can someone go into what the differences are and how, say, Bitcoin effectuates multi-sig versus, say, how Ethereum effectuates multi-signature? Because they do it very differently, and I think that's an important distinction that we need to make.
So the Bitcoin introduced something called multi-signature transactions back, I think, in early 2011, 2012. They probably didn't get heavily used
12.
until
12.
There you go. They didn't get heavily used for a couple of years. It took a long time to roll them out and to get to wallets that supported them. Today, I don't think a wallet under the sun that doesn't support multi-signature transactions on Bitcoin, both sending and receiving. The simple nature of multi-signature is you can have up to 15 signatories that can have any type of M of N type of situation where you need to have something like 3 out of 5, 2 out of 3. It could be 15 out of 15 or 1 out of 1. 1 out of 15, type of transactions that take place, and until you actually have signatures from all of those signatories, transactions just simply will not occur. The nature of Bitcoin is that ultimately you are talking about a scripting language. You are talking about creating scripts that execute code, but they're simpler than Ethereum. Ethereum doesn't technically have multisig at all. Ethereum has a complex scripting language where you can create essentially almost arbitrary calculations and arbitrary signatures. And as a result, the implementation of something called multisig in Ethereum is non-standard. You build your own. And so if you're a BitGo, you create your own version of multisig transactions or emulation on top of the Ethereum network. Parity also created a multisig wallet. It unfortunately was flawed, and there was an attacker that was able to go ahead and basically replace the underlying libraries that are called in a particular smart contract where several $100 million worth of Ethereum were held. A good chunk of it held by Parity for their own Polkadot ICO. It's a little bit ironic there that they held their own funds in their own wallet and managed to lose it because of a flaw in their own multisig technology. The answer is that they're very different. They're very different implementations, and it takes a lot more thought and process to go ahead and securely create a multiple person signer transaction in anything else besides Bitcoin or other chains that are created like it.
And I would say not an on-chain multi-sig, which is what Ivan's been describing, but there are other, I would say not more, but other commonly accepted implementations of multi-sig, something where you still have to have an M of N, but you're not using the underlying blockchain protocol, the underlying blockchain tech to affect that multi-signature control. You're using an off-chain algorithm. The most common one is Shamir secret sharing, which allows you to take a secret, and this gets a little bit kind of inception, the dream in the dream situation, but a secret that's protecting either protecting the private key that you're using to sign the transaction, or you're actually taking the private key that you use to sign the transaction and splitting it using Shamir in a way to where you can mandate, is it 2 of 5, 3 of 5, whatever your M of N protocol requires, but that does not use the blockchain protocol. It uses something that is generally considered off-chain multi-sig. Mileage can vary on that, and there's a lot of different opinions. Is that real multi-sig? Is it not? But that is another implementation of how multi-sig, or another modality in which how multi-sig is achieved in probably a number of places today still.
Yeah, most of the
And
places.
this seems like a good place to go ahead and break into MPC.
Yeah, so let's talk about MPC, guys. So about 26 years ago, French cryptographer by name of Pascal Pallier. He basically invented the new kind of cryptography, which both him and many others, including me, we were sure that we will not see it engineeringly implemented during our lives. So about 4 years ago, I would say 5 years ago, 5 years ago already, a couple of professors from Israel, technically Professor Yuda Lindell and Professor Ran Canetti, they both almost independently found a little breakthrough that allowed MPC, multi-party computation, or SMPC, secure multi-party computation, to become possible to implement engineeringly. Currently in the world, 4 companies embraced into this competition. Michael represents one of them. In my eyes, the winner. But again, it's a holy grail of modern cryptography. It's very hard to explain without diving into mathematics, but it's basically Shamir's secret sharding on steels, which is technically in engineering, from engineering standpoint, it makes multi-sig the real one. So the shards in this case, they cannot be just intercepted by complicated attack against infrastructure. Cryptographic attack per se is not possible. At least nobody suggested yet. So, Michael, you want to talk more about MPC? I don't know.
Just one thing on that. The way I like to look at MPC versus, let's say, standard Shmir's secret sharing is that if you have, let's say, a key that is broken up into multiple shards using Shmir's, you either need to physically or electronically reconstruct that key in one place at one time in order to go ahead and use the key again. MPC makes it so that you do not need to do that. You can go ahead and separate the shards, keep them electronically and physically away from each other, and be able to go ahead and perform a set of calculations and math and interaction between the two devices to allow for a transaction to be created, which does not reveal the key itself.
And it's also independent from blockchain. Yeah. Technically, any key for any cryptography, for any cryptographic circuit or crypto system can be used.
So I think, clearly, I don't know. The funny thing is that, the short history that we are dealing with MPC. Like when we started, I was actually not a huge fan of MPC, and I had a lot of arguments with Uri about it. But my CTO and VP already sort of decided to go down the MPC path, and we found ourselves, the leading or one of the leading vendors that utilizes this technology. I think there are a couple of interesting aspects there. It is from the high level key value proposition. The first one, as Ivan said, I think Shamir secret sharing is sort of at the end of the day, it's like a distributed Shamir secret sharing, where with Shamir secret sharing, as Adam explained, at the end of the day, you do have at least the key at rest, right? When you don't need to do a transaction, the key is basically sitting in multiple different compartments, maybe in 5 different vaults. But when you actually need to build the transaction, you need to reconstruct them together, sign the transaction. You're actually getting a proper form of the private key at that point, and then you basically destroy the private key and it disappears, right? But there is a very short period of time that the private key does exist on one computer, on one machine, and if a sophisticated attacker is able to get to that machine somehow, then you are in a situation where the key can be compromised. With MPC, it sort of takes it to the next level where you don't have this situation at all, where basically those multiple compartments are able to chat with each other in it's really closest as you can get to black magic. Basically, they challenging each other using this zero knowledge proof protocol, and eventually, in a magical way, they're able to recreate a valid transaction. Now, the advantage there, beyond the black magic, which is really, really cool, is that one, clearly you eliminate a single point of failure. The second property is that, very similar to Shavuot secret sharing, it works across all the protocols, right? So you're not, the way that it works on Bitcoin is the same way that it works on Ethereum, the same way that it works on the number 2000 in the coin market cap, basically the last, I don't know, like the newest blockchain that was invented. And that gives you, from a security standpoint and from an engineering standpoint, it gives you this advantage, like that you build one implementation and you're basically focusing all the effort on validating that implementation, both like, from internal audit, external audit, publications, etc. And if that implementation is secure, then it actually works across all the assets. So that's like, advantage number one. Advantage number two, actually, compared to the multi-sig, like on-chain multi-sig discussion, is that if you're utilizing the standard multisig for Bitcoin, this is actually visible on the blockchain. So if I have a company or if I have a hedge fund and I store a large amount of assets in that specific address, someone from outside can look at that address and actually understand that that address basically requires 3 signers out of 5. Okay? With what it worth, that can be information that is not desirable, right? When you use Bolshevik secret sharing or MPC, then it actually looks like a standard one address on the blockchain. No one actually knows what's the structure behind it. Now, truth to be told, while MPC, I think it's a very advantageous technology when you're doing hot storage security. I'm not sure that it's actually applicable, for example, for cold, because it's an interactive method, right? So for example, in our implementation, there are basically 6 handshakes, right, between all those components that need to occur in order to create a transaction. Clearly, in cold storage, the effort which will require you to do 6 of these handshakes, I'm not sure if it's really practical, right? So at least with where we at right now with this kind of technology is that it's very useful for securing hot wallets or hot storage, but really it's fairly new.
So one of the things that used to concern me, outside of protecting the, the private keys themselves, is API key connectivity to the exchanges. If that was inadvertently leaked and there was withdrawal rights or trading rights, effectively somebody has complete access to all of your assets and completely bypass, any control you have over the wallet. So how do you control the API keys?
Let me say here, you cannot control it. You are doomed. If you exchange, you are doomed. And I can tell you why, guys. Of course, we can go step by step how to hack exchange. Any exchange. None of them is secure. Sorry, guys, for news. Don't keep your assets there. Do transaction and disappear. But it's true. Again, us as Genesis as an organization, we never keep nothing on exchanges besides what we want to trade and what we are ready to lose. And board is signed on risk acceptance. So the thing is, you would not believe where problem comes from. Problem comes from DNS system of our internet. It's centralized. Boom, game over. Anybody can own DNS. You can use free WebKit, which is a little bit tricky to use. You can buy WebKit in dark market, which is a couple of $1,000s. It's the same thing, I can own any one of you email. I can own any exchange out there. So you try to protect API keys, you're doomed. Just forget about it.
This got dark really fast.
Everyone give up.
Yeah, so the company that I work for is actually majority owned by Intercontinental Exchange, which also owns New York Stock Exchange. So I would not say that every exchange is doomed. Just to be clear, if anyone from the press is here.
Exchanges.
Okay. I have no comment.
Marketplaces as they called by the DFS. Yeah.
But I think this just gets to, yeah, I love the paranoia and the breeding of the darkness over there, and it is true, right? Anything, a motivated attacker with enough resources and time will compromise anything they want. Like you simply aren't going to be able to protect yourself over a long enough time horizon. But I do think this just kind of gets back to a point I made earlier, where you have to have good cyber hygiene, right? If you're storing your API key in Coinbase.txt on your C drive, it's probably going to be a bad day for you eventually. But I think it really does just get to good cyber hygiene, having good protocols in place. As leaders of companies, leaders of security organizations, it's really on us to equip our staff, and not just our staff, but the company at large, to have the right processes and tooling and things in place, so that way they're not doing things like Coinbase.txt API key on the C drive. So I think there are ways to make it harder. I always like to say, I don't have to be faster than the bear, I just have to be faster than Ivan. And I say that because he's sitting next to me. But if you make it hard for an attacker, they'll go somewhere else. And I think that's why you haven't really seen, well, I won't say that. You haven't seen in very recent times, you haven't seen a material breach against one of the top tier exchanges. The API key question is a little bit loaded because there was some issues that happened a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, at a pretty well-known exchange. But that was a matter of bad hygiene. It was a developer got phished, to Ivan's point earlier. Phishing led to API key credentials that were stolen, a token that was stolen. There were some other issues with the API key. Those credentials were then used against an API to actually break multisig. Those were credentials used to get multisig accomplished at a third party. And then I forget the exact number, but a lot of Bitcoin were stolen. So it really does just get back to good hygiene and protecting yourself against the basics: phishing, social engineering, those types of things.
I mean, one of the problems is that we talk about cold storage a bunch in terms of an exchange interactivity. API generated key, it can't be cold. First of all, because the exchange creates it on your behalf. It's not something you create yourself. And then secondarily, because you are only interacting with the exchange through the internet. And then when you want to go ahead and use the keys, you're going to need to go ahead and have it either connected directly with an internet attached machine, or it has to be a machine which then has a proxy which then connects to the internet. So you need to come up with a very different set of hygiene requirements for exchange API integration. It is essentially like calling a hot wallet at all times, and then having a lot of trust in that third party as well.
Yeah. So I mean, this is one of the problems that we decided to tackle from day one, because we recognize that really, this is a huge gap for most of the organizations that are actually trading. The approach that we have taken, I think it's sort of twofold. One, if you look at people who don't have, best hygiene or good hygiene, is that they will use password, right? Just regular credentials, username and password to log into the exchange and to do the sensitive operations that way. As you all know, passwords are extremely susceptible to phishing and a variety of other attacks like keylogging, etc. So, the next level of sort of increasing slightly the security is probably to use API keys, because API keys, you don't need to fetch them all the time from your Coinbase.txt file, or you don't have a small note on a small yellow note next to your computer with your username and password. But still, basically, if the API key, if the machine where the API key resides is compromised, then the hackers have the API keys. We came up with one solution, which essentially, we allow our customers to store the API keys in basically chipset level security, secure enclaves in the cloud, utilizing some new technology that is called SGX, basically a new form of hardware isolation. Technically, by the way, you can also do it with HSMs. You can also load API keys into either on-prem or cloud HSMs and use that. I'm frankly I'm not sure I've seen many people doing that. Surprisingly,
HSM, just for the crowd, maybe you want to define that. People probably don't know it.
Hardware security models. So it's basically HSMs are like big boxes. That I think how much they cost? 70 grand. Manufactured by right now it's actually one company that manufactures them because they merged. I don't know if it's Dallas or Javato, but they basically merged. It's sort of like a dedicated computer that allows you to store cryptographic keys. First of all, it can only store those cryptographic keys and sign a transaction, and it also has this unique property that if you try to unlock that computer or physically unlock the computer, break it with something heavy, then it will explode the keys, right? Basically there is an electronic circuit over there that will destroy the keys. So HSMs traditionally were utilized to provide sort of military-grade security for cryptographic elements. Technically, you can use them for storing API keys. Having said that, it's very expensive. Two, it's also very inaccessible. It does require a certain amount of maintenance. So we took, I would say, a very similar approach of basically using new technology that provides, I would say, similar properties. So that's sort of I think where probably the most advanced situation that you can get to right now is where we at in terms of what the exchanges provide. I think the next step for the exchanges is actually to support slightly more advanced protocols like auth that they do not support today, and SAML. So there are protocols that are utilized in enterprise cybersecurity that are designed to provide more resilience against those situations, because you can actually distribute the API key in a more secure way. There's also one API key for each service that is trying to access the exchange, and you can basically revoke those API keys on the fly. Unfortunately, I think most of the exchanges are not supporting this protocol at the moment, and to be honest, we were trying to have conversation with most of the, or just the major ones. It isn't their priority list, but it's not high in the priority.
Yeah, it's actually weird that none of exchanges provides in cryptography called rekeying. So it's basically changing the API key, changing session key. There are a number of cryptocurrency projects out there which utilize it already, but it's not for exchange. But I mean, inside the protocol itself, Zen is one of them, Zcash is another, and Zcash is just starting basically. The rekeying is a very powerful thing, but it's very strange that they don't do it. Again, main problem is that many web systems, web applications out there, not only exchanges, they all love APIs and they love to expose their keys and like to create these things. I don't know many of them why they even doing that, but fashionable.
But I'm sure that there will not be now one exchange that is coming to market with a much superior security.
Yes, Adam, we believe in you.
Just for the record, I didn't say anything.
It's going to be ready by the end of the day.
I don't answer those questions. If you want to talk about security, I'm your guy. Product, timelines, not my thing.
So the dreaded 51% attack against major blockchains, not the the Dogecoins. How realistic is it, and are there any ways to protect against it?
The best answer is that it's not something that's impossible to happen. 51% attack simply requires an attacker to have either control or direct access to have a large amount of, at this point, specialized equipment described as ASICs, application-specific integrated chips that don't do anything else besides something like the proof-of-work algorithm that Bitcoin uses, which is SHA-256 or SHA-2. And the type of attacker that would be able to go pull this off is either somebody who is capable of breaching a number of large pools, large mining organizations today, which would be possible that, say, for example, either a relatively skilled attacker could go ahead and do this even as an individual, potentially. Certainly as a nation-state attacker, it would be relatively inexpensive to pull it off from a breach standpoint, but it would probably be a one-time attack, and it wouldn't be something that would be easily repeatable. The next type of attack, which would be more, debilitating, would be something where, a large attacker gains a permanent access to a large pool of equipment to go ahead and pull an attack off on the network. People have done calculations for how much it would cost. It's certainly in the tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars worth of equipment, plus a large stream of electricity. So it's a type of thing that it's very possible for a nation state to pull it off. It's probably possible for an eccentric billionaire to probably pull off if they were interested in all the problems that would ensue if they were to attempt it. But there are a limited number of individuals, corporations, or nations that would be capable of doing it, and then you have to get into motivations. And it's the type of thing where, could somebody go ahead and create a laser large enough to go ahead and write a foul word on the moon? They could. But, how many people are willing to go ahead and spend that kind of money to go pull it off? And the answer so far, at least, has been none. We'll see how long that lasts.
On Bitcoin.
And really, I guess the question is, to what aim? Whatever type of attack that, let's say, for example, somebody pulled off, it would be something where most likely the repercussions would be that, yes, it would go ahead and devalue the price of Bitcoin. Whether or not somebody would be able to go ahead and financially gain from that would be a secondary question of is there a product that's available to go short on Bitcoin that would be sufficient liquidity, and that on top of that would be able to be something that could be, executed and pulled off where the funds could be withdrawn and spent someplace else that was probably not in Bitcoin. And so far today, I think that the answer would probably be very difficult to pull that off, and think that the costs would actually go ahead and be less than the gains. Now, maybe as the derivatives market gets more liquid, maybe this becomes a bigger problem. You have a $100 billion asset set today. If you can go ahead and maybe, say, for example, take out a $10 billion liquid short on Bitcoin, and then pull off a minor 51% attack, and maybe manage to go ahead and roll back 3, 4, 5, 10 blocks or something like that, and pull off some kind of a transaction attack that shows that Bitcoin is insecure. Maybe it only costs you, $50 million to do this. This is a worthwhile attack. So far to date, the derivatives markets are not liquid enough and are probably too well scrutinized for that to be something that it would be easy to do. Love for somebody else to jump in, though.
Yeah, I would completely agree, and I think it's the on-ramps and off-ramps, right? It's like, how do you have to swap that crypto asset for either another crypto asset or fiat at some point, and that would be an off-ramp. You have to get out of that. And yeah, I would say I completely agree, and it's just too scrutinized. You're not going to be able to move that volume. I guarantee half this room's inboxes would light up if that amount of if that size of a Bitcoin transaction were to happen, because everyone's monitoring these things. So yeah, I would completely agree that it would be the risk versus reward versus long-term value or even short-term value is just simply not there. Now, I do think it gets back to motivation. If the motivation was to shut it down or to disrupt the network, or an eccentric billionaire thought that the US dollar was going to be devalued to a point and Bitcoin was the culprit for doing that, I mean, maybe there is intrinsic value there that is not necessarily them off-ramping their crypto asset into fiat.
So 51% attack is it's a feature of any blockchain, public blockchain based on POW, proof of work. So it means the one that includes mining. There is even very nice website that friend of mine from Brazil put last year that explains how much it will cost you to do 51% attack per hour. So it's definitely very, very expensive for Bitcoin. It's probably very expensive for top 5 cryptocurrencies by hash rate. So hash rate is actually means how strong, how big network, mining network of specific currency. So for small cryptocurrencies, 51% is very cheap. It's very easy to achieve from your laptop. You can buy all the hash power from the nice hash and a couple of other guys like that from the cloud, and you basically can. Okay, there are a number of results of 51% attack that can be done. One of them, of course, is like you have too much hash rate and you basically like DDoSing the network of this specific cryptocurrency. But let's talk about financial motivation in these attacks. Technically, what 51% allows you is to rewrite blockchain. So because Satoshi consensus and more or less everybody, all the cryptocurrencies, all 2,000 and something of them, based on Satoshi consensus with some modifications here. The consensus mechanism is not modified. Indeed, it's actually still Satoshi's consensus. The attempt to transfer value in trustless environment by means of proof of work, of proof of stake, or all kind of other mechanisms, sub-mechanisms that appeared later. The thing is that it means that longest chain is actually the true chain. So again, there is no central authority that actually will say this block is true. Block is true because it belongs to the longest chain. So if you have 51% of hash rate, you can rewrite blockchain. The moment that you rewrite blockchain, you cannot sustain it for longer, even for small cryptocurrencies. Like some of them, it's maybe even days, but some of them hours. But it's enough to rewrite block or two to steal enough money. Sometimes even one block is enough. And this is what happened to many small cryptocurrencies. During the last year, at least, I know at least circa 50 cryptocurrency projects that got affected by 51% attacks. And none of them are recovered besides one, which is, again, I'm part of this project, that why it sounds unfair, but the only project now that's cannot be attacked by 51% and proof of work project, it's Zen, what was called Zencash, now called Horizon. We implemented very simple trick, modified Satoshi mechanism, Satoshi consensus, very simple engineering punishment for any strong miner, any strong attacker that has a lot of hash rate. We tested it 6 months last year with participation of Bitmain, which is the biggest miner in the world. And it was proven working, and on October it went live on mainnet on Zen, and since then many tried to attack it 51%, many failed. I really hope that many people will find this article, many people I mean who work on cryptocurrency projects and will implement the same simple solution. It's actually very interesting how Satoshi himself missed this solution.
I'm going to ask a few more questions, and I'm going to open up to the audience. So start thinking of what you want to ask these guys. It's been said that you can't have both security and convenience, or security and regulation. You have to choose one and then lose the other. What are your thoughts? Mine. That's yours.
Yes.
Yeah, guys, it's a very interesting discussion. But of course, security and convenience, like anybody who will tell you these two can go together, will just a lie. You compromise, you get every convenience or security. You can never combine two. I never seen a system that can combine two. So it's pretty simple answer, impossible. Regulation and security is actually a very interesting thing. The main problem with regulation is, of course, we want us to be transparent because we want to surveil us, and of course, all this libertarian thing that I don't want to get into. The thing is that to achieve real security, you basically have only 3 options. And this is what most of security programs and certifications and whatever is out there who teach CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, they don't, I don't know how they don't know that they're teaching something wrong and actually doing something wrong. That's why they're hacked. to achieve security in data world and information technology world, it's only three things that you can do. The easiest thing and the first thing is like to devaluate your data, so nobody will want it. If you can do it, you're great. Nobody will hack you. The second thing is encrypt and take care of keys. And this is how Bitcoin was created, because the whole idea of it was secure by design. Use encryption. This is the only thing, the only way that you can do to secure your data. The third thing is decentralized. The problem is that the moment that you use centralization, central authority, central identity, or central whatever, it's doomed. It will be hacked because it's a single point of failure. And even if you try to do it pseudo-decentralized, like to create like, I don't know, 2, 3, 10, 100 points of failure, it's still centralized. It will be hacked. So that's why if anybody asks me, will that bank or that hedge fund hack? Yeah, of course, just a matter of time and desire of someone to steal something from that.
Sure. So, my personal opinion is that I don't think you can like get them into. You cannot like achieve 100% both, right? But I think you can get them close, and I think traditionally. People, like the people who cared about security didn't care about user experience, and people that care about user experience and speed of execution didn't care about security, right? So people were not like, mindful for the same problems at once. I think the company that, like from my personal experience, from my past life of this global security, I must give like the credit, for example, for Apple, right? That Apple actually was able to achieve a reasonably high level of both user experience and security over a reasonably short course of the lifespan of the product, right? So when when they brought the iPhone to market, and even like in 2012, the iPhones were like completely insecure. You could send them a PDF file and hack them, and that was like 2012. Not like 6-7 years later, right? It's super like the cost of owning an iPhone remotely is in the range of like $2 million, right, to buy an exploit for an iPhone, which is like substantially higher. Now, clearly, back to centralization, iPhone made a compromise on the third thing. They're like highly centralized company, right? The way that they achieve their security is that everything goes through the App Store, right? Everybody knows that. Now, there is a question of how much of this sort of security model we can achieve, security and usability, we can achieve in a system that is decentralized by nature, right? Which is basically where we want to get with blockchain, that we don't have this hyper centralization of entities, and there is one concentrated counterparty risk. So I think we need to be very mindful. I think that also by the way, this will be key to achieve mass adoption of this technology, because with all due respect, there are great projects that people are working on. For example, Lightning Network, which actually sort of facilitates real payments on top of Bitcoin, right? Payments that can move very quickly, like you pay with Venmo. But to set up a Lightning app or a Lightning node is 20 pages, it's a manual of 20 pages, right? And this is designed for consumers, right? So clearly people are not sort of, I think that we still need to get to the mindset that we need things to be reasonably secure, but also very, very usable.
I would just add, I agree, but I would add a little bit of color on the second part of the question, which was around compliance or was it regulation. Is that what it was? Regulation. Regulation means regulators, means compliance, means checklists. One way to surely fail at the security game is to have your compliance audit checklist, go through it, and then have your GC or your chief compliance officer, and I saw a lawyer, a friend of mine in the back, so I'm not knocking on GCs or compliance officers. But for them to say, okay, you don't need any more budget, convince the CFO, we're secure because we have a SOC 2. We're secure because of X. We completed this checklist. That is a sure way to fail at security. So I do think there is a balance, but it's when you're dealing with regulation, I am a big fan, clearly, of working in deep partnership with regulators, but their goals are slightly different than the goals of a proper security program. So there will be this slight divergence at the end there, and hopefully they will see that only as value add.
I would just add that the analogy of how thick do you need your bulletproof glass probably applies here, and the answer is only thick enough to go ahead and stop a bullet. Will you know about that until the bullet's fired? No, but it's the type of thing where you don't necessarily need to have security that is above and beyond the threat that you're trying to protect. You know, everything sort of is an escalation. If you're a consumer and you want to go ahead and do consumer level transactions, basically spending the type of amount of money you might otherwise hold in physical cash in your wallet, an iPhone is a perfectly acceptable way to go ahead and store your cryptocurrency with a set of words that are backed up on a piece of paper in your sock drawer. Perfectly sufficient. You have a PIN and a fingerprint, associated with your phone, and that's probably going to go ahead and get 99.99% of people to be completely comfortable. You move up into the institutional level, you're protecting $1 billion worth of assets, and you need to have a checklist. You need to have a policy and procedure with multiple people, multiple locations, and you need to have extreme diligence and no laziness whatsoever for every single transaction. It has to be boring, it has to be routine, and it has to be something that is followed like the military, or else you'll lose money. So there's a lot of room in between those two types of scenarios, and it's really just about it being commensurate with risk meeting the security needs.
Any questions from the audience?
So you have been talking about the security in the crypto space, but there's an entirely different space, which is a company use blockchain technology build a product like for supply chain or for payments, etc., which has nothing to do with crypto. Have you had any practice in the security for that type of project? Do you have any guideline for the corporation who are building such projects?
Yeah, so frankly, we looked at it a bit. I think that fundamentally a lot of those projects are when they will become live, like most of those projects right now are in the lab, right? Or basically the amount of participants that they have on the network are very, very limited. Now, clearly, for example, if you're a big bank and you're building a payment network which has which is a private blockchain, or you are building a supply chain, at the point where you have 200 participants, right, which are individual entities that are operating on your network that are not part of your organization, you actually almost defaulting to the same security model of a public blockchain, right? Because basically, if one of those organizations is hacked, then they can access the blockchain and they can create pretty much the same damage as the things that we've seen in the public blockchain, right? The reason why you don't see it is because right now almost every private blockchain project, it has 15 participants, and not only that, they're also putting all those nodes in one co-location in the cloud, putting a big firewall around them, and it's okay, basically it's not yet exactly a blockchain. Once we will see those things go into the mainstream, or not even mainstream, into a mass production, and I believe that this will happen, it will almost be you will start to suffer from almost the same thing. And this is we actually work with some of the biggest financial organizations that they are involved in those projects. And at the end of the day, the security analysis that when you, right now, okay, you don't care because you don't have any risk because it's all in one data center. But once you will be handing those nodes to all the 200 banks that are your counterparties, you will have pretty much the same issues.
My advice, and I'll take a little bit of a different tack on that, is would be to first ask yourselves, do you really need a blockchain? Right? Before you even get down the security shift, and all the things that Michael said are very true in my opinion. There was a good slide at DEF CON this past year, and it was a little flow chart, had 2 boxes. One was, do you need a blockchain? There was an arrow to the second one, and the answer was no. So I don't know that I'm that maximalist on no, but I would say, what are you trying to do? And really ask, is it cool? Are you looking to get investor money? I've noticed, I'm a big fan of watching companies' job postings. I actually went through one point where I actually built this crawler so that way I could ingest companies I was looking for, because you get to see what their product roadmap is. If you're hiring a blockchain lead today, you're probably doing something with blockchain in the next year. It's actually a great source of intelligence against competitors and other companies, to include product stacks that they're using. But it's so funny to me when I see large Fortune 500s hire a blockchain engineer, and then the job posting disappears. Presumably they've hired somebody. 6 weeks later, they're announcing a internal blockchain pilot. You're like, okay, that was your first blockchain person, and 6 weeks nothing happened. You have a prototype maybe on a whiteboard.
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for this discussion. I think it's fascinating. So you spoke about insider threats and how vulnerable exchanges are, and security versus convenience. I'm just curious about what you think about the following interesting case of insider threat. And I'm going to quickly read two lines from an article that was published in February. Quadriga, Canada's biggest cryptocurrency exchange, said it's unable to gain access to 145 million of Bitcoin and other digital assets after Gerald Cotton, its 30-year-old CEO and co-founder, died while traveling in India. Many of the digital currencies held by Quadriga are stored offline in accounts known as cold wallets, a way of protecting them from hackers. Cotton is the only person with access to the wallets, according to the company. So what do you think? Did they went too far with the security?
I would love to talk about this. Yeah, so it's interesting. Actually, I'm really interested in whether or not he dies. If anyone knows, would love to chat. But I think it's actually an example of where regulation did not move fast enough, in my opinion. If that was a regulated exchange that required him, much like we have in the U.S., the registered investment advisors, there are lawyers in the room who can actually speak intelligently about the piece of law that requires this, but AUM, assets under management, over 150 million, they're required to store their assets with a qualified custodian. That prevents, more or less, the Bernie Madoff, hey, Michael, give me your money, I'm a fund manager, yeah, I have your money and I'm buying my jet and I really don't have your money scenario, the Madoff scenario, right? So if that would have happened and would have been mandated by the government, they would not be, those investors would not be in the situation they are now. Now, was it insider threat? Is he actually dead? Was he kidnapped? I have no idea. Again, would love to know. But it's been a long time since I got to see behind those curtains. But I would say that it's a case where regulators could have prevented that from happening. And you do see it now in the US. It's starting to become much more mainstream, not necessarily because regulations are clear or present, but because customers, whether those are institutional or retail / consumer customers, are demanding a certain standard.
Any other questions?
Yes. First of all, again, thank you. This is an amazing panel, and thank you for organizing it. Yuri, you mentioned very briefly about the fundamental failure or weakness rather of DNS. I do also know that there is a sort of in my estimate, and I know very little about that, but there is a grassroots DNS based on blockchain. Is that the solution to the DNS problem, and where do you see what is the maturity of that effort in terms of protecting the DNS overall and in general?
Yeah, there are a number of projects. Crypto. I mean, it's not exactly crypto. It's no. You know what? It does relate to crypto because all of them also creating some coins that try to create the new model of internet, which basically DNS. It's backbone of our internet, and it's owned by pretty corrupted organizations, more or less, out there. From personal acquaintance with them. The thing is that there are a number of projects that are trying to do that. Success of it will be questionable because it will be very hard to convince all the users of internet to switch to something. So money being invested, both, like there are two projects that I know. DCG is my company, my parent company, they basically act as a big investor in one of the projects. So a lot of money being poured into this. Adoption, I don't know, not in a short time. It's very hard to change the system that works pretty well for most consumers and for most organizations. And DNS works good. It will require a serious hack to do it. And the point is that I am convinced that such the hacks of DNS system occur every day. It's just none of the organizations involved report them. That's a big thing that regulation currently doesn't require proper report of breaches and hacks and everything. And yes, financial institutions, some credit bureaus, they obligated in the United States and Canada to report. None of DNS organizations, they don't need to report anything. There isn't, like, government kind of doesn't care.
No, I mean, depends what you call it, DNS. I mean, all those BGP rerouting, it's really like, DNS. Falls into the DNS hacking, I think.
Yeah, there are many.
Yeah, I would comment that the answer is not purely in the domain naming system is basically how you go ahead and take a human readable name and match it up with a non-human something like an IP address, and neither of which themselves are terribly secure. An IP address, such as was mentioned before, can be thwarted from a BGP session hijack, where you believe that the route that you're supposed to be taking is not the actual route. DNS itself is a centralized system which can be subject to attacks either at the center or at the edge closest to you. I mean, when you jump onto a Starbucks Wi-Fi, you are fully trusting that, first of all, that nobody has, either intentionally or unintentionally allowed that router at that Starbucks to be breached, because they can just simply supply you with any DNS information that they want to. The only thing that saves most people from having those kind of breaches to happen all the time is certificate issuance. You have a certificate on your laptop. It was issued by Microsoft or one of the other DNS registrars or the certificate registrars, and the company has a certificate, and that handshake between those two computers over SSL or TLS 3.0 at this point is the only thing that stops people from going to the wrong website. Something that's probably illustrative here is that if you look at something like Swift is not a mechanism for moving money. Swift is a mechanism for sending messages securely between two parties. And interestingly enough, if you look at how Swift is organized, it is not a centralized system. When two banks, when Citigroup wants to go ahead and correspond with Deutsche Bank, they are both Swift counterparties, but they don't go ahead and just simply get a set of certificates from the central Swift registry. They will go ahead and have a key exchange ceremony between Deutsche and Citibank directly. They have their security people and compliance people involved. They go ahead and verify each other's identity. They don't trust somebody else to go ahead and issue them that certificate. And the only reason why that they know that they're talking to each other securely is because they both have their own private public key pair that they can go ahead and use to correspond to each other. And so that's probably a non-scalable solution, but it is a secure means for how that a mesh network is set up, where you don't trust anybody besides the one counterparty you're dealing with. Just interestingly enough, during this event, we got news that one of the largest exchanges globally suffered some type of a breach. I had a chance for all of 30 seconds to go ahead and skim a report. Binance, it seems, had their hot wallet breached, some type of a combination of phishing and 2FA type of attacks on, I assumed, what to be Binance employees. It wasn't exactly clear. Resulted in the loss of a number of customer API keys, and the attackers were very, very patient, waited till the right opportunity to go ahead and coordinate a number of probably transfers and ultimately create a single withdrawal of 7,000 Bitcoin worth approximately almost $40 million. Binance says that they're covering it, but it's amazing how important security is, and it's very hard to get right.
Or stated.
I was about to say, conveniently, Yuri has a room full of alibis.
So maybe it wasn't that dark. It was practical advice. The real question is who's insuring Binance?
The CZ has plenty of funds to cover it. It appears.
Any other questions?
We were just speaking about breaches and hacks, so I guess my question for the panel is blockchain forensics. How do you think blockchain forensics will play out in the next few years? How will it build, grow, or what do you guys think will happen in the next few years with blockchain forensics? And I guess things that haven't been identified just yet.
I would start off with the fact that if you wanted to go ahead and steal funds and hide them, Bitcoin is probably the worst way on the planet to do it. The blockchain analysis tools that are available are getting better and better. The number of three-letter agencies within this organization, within this country, or other places around the world are very, very aware of how important crypto transactions are, in particular to certain nation states that depend upon it for their economies. It's just not a good tool for moving large amounts of money, because you ultimately need to go ahead and have somebody else who's going to go ahead and accept that as funds. And it's not like North Korea can easily just go pay, for example, for a bunch of nuclear weapons, to Pakistan with Bitcoin. That is not a thing, at least not yet today. And so ultimately you're going to need on-ramps and off-ramps, and it is relatively hard to move large sums of money in and out of Bitcoin without having a trace on it. It's sort of like LoJack from the 90s and 2000s. It wasn't the type of thing where your car was not going to be protected. The thief was going to get away with it, and they were going to go ahead and take it to a chop shop. The thing is that eventually the thief was going to go ahead and get nabbed because they didn't notice that there was a tracker in the car, and that the car would be dismantled, but there would be 200 other cars there, and they would go ahead and dismantle the ring of thieves who would be pulling off the attacks. And so over time, the organizations that that try and pull off hacks, breaches, and thefts of Bitcoin are going to become identified, because blockchain history is forever, and maybe you can't go ahead and identify a particular theft, but you have enough information to go ahead and corroborate transactions to put them together and eventually be able to go ahead and trace the attackers. It's something that, at least on a public, transparent blockchain like Bitcoin, it's just a bad tool for theft. For large sums. For small sums, it probably works just fine.
I think the vendor market is, to Ivan's point, largely solving that problem, and it's going to very quickly become a crowded market, and there will be a lot of really great tools out there, and then some not so great tools, and I think the blockchains that will be interesting for nefarious activity will have to get more attention by those vendors. And you start to get into some fairly complex situations dealing with native privacy coins, something like a Monero or others. And how are they going to solve that problem, I think, is going to be the answer that I don't know that anyone, if there's a vendor in the audience, come, let's talk about Monero forensics. But I don't know that there is one that has solved that problem yet, at least not to like an acceptable level, as has some other tools for Bitcoin and others. But then you get also into an issue. How do you, if you steal Bitcoin, how do you swap it into Monero, and who's accepting Monero? It's not that widely adopted. It's not that widely known. I mean, there's all sorts of other issues there. It almost feels like the market's kind of like self-regulating, or the ecosystem of cryptocurrencies is some degree self-regulating.
Monero privacy is a feature, not a bug, not a problem.
I agree. Well, I half agree.
Yeah, I think that clearly, like the ultimate play over there will be like the off-ramp, right? Which is basically great. You were able to, how much? 40 million?
7,000 Bitcoin.
So, yeah, you were able to steal 7,000 Bitcoins from Binance. How do you going to cash out, right? Like, which exchange will accept those 7,000 Bitcoins and will send you US dollars, right? One option is that, at some point in the future, we'll not need to off-ramp, right? Which will be probably great to all of us, because That would be like, it means that cryptocurrencies are well adopted. But as long as, like, as you said, like, because the forensics, like the vendors over there, it is like, probably the most mature category within the cryptocurrency or blockchain space. It will become more and more integrated into all the places where you can off-ramp and exchange it. And then I think, like, those hacks, although they will happen, it will be really like the people will be incentivized, or the motivation, there will be less motivation because you will not have the option to cash out.
To add more, it's okay. Technically, there are no tools per se for blockchain forensics right now. There are tools with mostly for know your customer, anti-money laundering things. There are about 7 competitors of the market, some of them on the more advanced stage, some of them on the less advanced stage. The thing is that all of them know how to read Bitcoin blockchain. None of them knows how to read privacy coins. Zcash, Zen, Monero, Green, all of these are too complex for them. The privacy coins, blockchains, by their nature, they are advanced crypto systems, advanced cryptographic circuits, advanced cryptographic systems. It requires very non-standard knowledge, even from cryptographer, even to understand how ZK snarks and ZK Starks, the new generation, work now. It's really not trivial. So, but interestingly enough, so these tools are, like Ivan mentioned, but basically criminals who are using Bitcoin, it's kind of sounds stupid because it's pretty easy. It's not pretty easy, but it's relatively easy to find them, to trace them. The problem is that criminals are very inventive guys. Coin joins, the recent problem that actually came after tumblers, it's something that defeats these tools right away. And it's amazing. When Chainalysis guys released a report that they were surprised by their own findings that most of dark web still using, instead of privacy coins, still using Bitcoin. I know the guys from Chainalysis, and we discussed it with them, like how come? And how come is actually the answer is inventive criminals, coin joins. So once it was tumblers, today is coin joins. It's basically it's almost the same. You mix transactions, many transactions together, and then it's very hard to trace transaction to its origin.
I would add to that that a lot of people are getting caught, though. Whether or not they're getting caught because they're using Bitcoin or they're using bad criminal hygiene on the dark web or whatever it might be. And there was a public RFP, I don't know, it's 60 days ago, 90 days ago, that the U.S. Marshal Service put out regarding, it wasn't an RFP, excuse me, it was an RFI or something like that, requesting help in understanding how they could store crypto assets, specifically Bitcoin, but they actually said any crypto asset. So if you read in between the lines a little bit, one could assume that U.S. Marshals has crypto assets that they've seized, and they're actively building skill sets in research and forensics and other things to allow them to catch bad guys or bad girls using cryptocurrencies on the dark web or wherever, to a point where they're actually soliciting public help from industry experts to figure out how to store large scales, like tens of millions of dollars worth of crypto assets securely.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. It's an interesting discussion, and I appreciate you guys sharing your knowledge so openly with all of us. So there's quite a few things I've learned. Hopefully some of the people also learn something. So I guess when you started, I think, Ivan, when you started this discussion, you said, encryption is like, number one kind of priority, right? Whether you encrypt sensitive, confidential data or cryptocurrency, right? But at the end of the day, isn't it about identity? If you're talking about MFA, right? You can impersonate people, you can, trick MFA. So at the end of the day, if you can impersonate and get someone else's identity, you can have access to those keys, right?
I think that identity definitely plays into your risk analysis. If, say, for example, if you're dealing with an anonymous transactor. Basically, say for example, you're dealing with a decentralized type of exchange or some type of atomic swap or other type of transaction where you're going Bitcoin to Litecoin or something similar where you don't know your counterparty, then you have to trust the systems implicitly entirely. There's no law which is going to go ahead and execute performance for you if they don't go ahead and deliver. Whereas if you're an institutional player and if Bakkt is, say for example, doing a transaction with Galaxy, we're not likely to go ahead and attempt to use cryptographic tricks to go ahead and steal funds from each other because we have an underlying contract which backs up performance, and we can sue each other, in the normal court of law to go ahead and get that performance. So identity definitely plays into risk analysis. If you know the identity of your counterparty and if you've done a credit check on their background and if you've done taint analysis on the source of coins, then you reduce a lot of risks that are associated with, say for example, concerns about 51% attacks, where you're doing something with Ether Classic and it's a very, very low hash rate, low proof of work type of coin. If you're dealing with a counterparty that you know and trust, to go ahead and not attempt to go ahead and collude with a miner to go pull off some type of attack where it find out that the transaction that you just received, it turns out is not a valid included transaction in the blockchain. If you don't have to worry about that, then it's not as much of a concern. In terms of identity, Bitcoin by itself doesn't have specific names and addresses associated with them, but unless you have an extremely secure, extremely paranoid, from an OPSEC standpoint, dark web user, they're going to leak information. They're going to go ahead and use an IP address at some point. They're going to go ahead and use some device which doesn't have perfect DNS lookups going to some kind of a Tor or VPN or combination of both type of sourced requests. They're going to go ahead and meet somebody in person to do a transaction. They're going to go ahead and hire somebody who is a informant working for law enforcement to go ahead and work on their their dark web project. They're just going to go ahead and get caught at some point down the line, and they will slip up and they'll mess up. So identity is one of those types of things where unless the tools end up becoming much, much easier to use and much more ubiquitous from a Monero, Zcash, Tor, and privacy standpoint, then there's just going to be too many ways for people just to go ahead and breach their identity, and therefore it's going to put a certain degree of expectation that, hey, look, the place to go ahead and still do crime is going to be using cash or other types of financial or instruments to go ahead and do transactions.
I've been saying this for probably 9 months now that distributed identity, digital identity in the distributed world is not solved. I keep hoping someone will solve it. One of these days I'm just going to go solve it myself, but that would require a lot of time. In the current practical sense, let's kind of forget dark web, shady people doing crazy things, hiring hitmen and selling keys of cocaine. Like, let's forget those people, and let's just think, how is the vast majority of crypto bought, sold, traded today? Right, it's done on retail exchanges, consumer exchanges, or through some type of institutional relationship, whether it's through an OTC desk or something along those lines. In the retail consumer context, there's AML and KYC, there's scan your passport, take a photo of it. There are protocols in place relying on traditional means to ascertain the identity of the retail consumer and onboard them to your exchange platform and allow them to transact. In the business or institutional space, whether that's to an exchange or to an OTC desk or anything along those lines, it's even more rigorous. You have business level AML, KYC, articles of organization, and directors have to have background checks and all these other things. In the world that a lot of us live, we are dealing not just in the institutional space like a family office, but in the regulated institutional space. So you also have to have licenses from the Department of Financial Services and all BIT licenses and trust, all these other things. So it's basically know your customer at an extreme level. So I think in the current way the vast majority of these transactions are happening in both institutional and retail, the identity piece is solved using traditional mechanisms.
Yeah, but probably to add to that, I think it was 2 months ago, fairly one of the biggest market makers in the crypto space, they basically lost $4 million because they put they used some escrow agent, basically a lawyer, I don't remember from which country, and gave them their Bitcoin or whatever, their cash, and that they disappear, right? So, and frankly, like for me, it basically means that we didn't reach the real utilization of the technology, right? Because at the end of the day, what Bitcoin is supposed to, or blockchain in general, right? What it's supposed to allow us, whether it's in the enterprise use case or in the public use case, is to eliminate direct counterparty risk, right? You're not supposed to have a counterparty risk to the person you're trading with, and the technology does supposed to allow a completely untrusted relationship between two parties without them being able to defraud each other, right? Right now, we only assuming if you put the 51% attack scenario aside for a second, in the case of just a one-directional transaction, we are already there, right? I mean, if I send you my Bitcoins, as long as there is no 51% attack, you're going to get them after within technically within 1
6 confirmation.
Yeah, 6 confirmation, but technically if there is no one, if there is no 51% attack within 1 confirmation. The thing is that right now, and there are multiple solutions now in flight that basically are supposed to also solve the bidirectional relationship, right? To basically create on-chain escrows, swaps, all kind of technology like that. That frankly, yeah, true. Maybe Galaxy and Bakkt, they have contracts between them. Which will facilitate some an issue where one of them defaults. But actually, if they will use that contract, they would never need to go to a lawyer. They would never need to go to a court to actually use that. We're not there yet, but I think we'll be there in the next 12 months.
I think it's, and I would just end this theme, maybe unless anyone else has an opinion, with it's also important to remember this is not a new problem. Identity, KYC, still fails regularly in traditional financial services. HSBC is the shining example of recent years. This is it's still very much a real problem. If you have nefarious people that are inventive, they will find ways to get around these problems. And by problems, I mean controls.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thank you.